Well, it is a thrill to be here this morning. Professor Boudreau, ladies and gentlemen, fellow alumni, I am so happy to be the keynote speaker, but I do it with a certain degree of trepidation and worry. You see, I teach Jewish history at Yeshiva University, among many great medievalists. And when they give a talk about Maimonides, nobody gets up in the audience and says, hey, listen, buddy, I heard what Maimonides said, and that's not the way you're telling the story. So I look out in the audience, and I know that there could be a very robust Q&A. $37. $37 a semester from 1967 to 1971. President Boudreau, that was the entire nut to go to City College. Unbelievable, right? What did I get for $37 a semester? Number one, I got a chance to study with a great historian, Bernard Bellish, who taught me the rigors of scholarship. And I'm going to say more about Bernie Bellish later on. I studied with Fred L. Israel, who gave to me an enthusiasm for history, and with his sardonic humor to understand some of the intricacies and foibles of history. And then moving over to the English department, I studied with the iconic Irving Rosenthal, about whom you'll hear more probably later on, who taught me about the importance of writing accessible prose, not only for scholars, but for the general public. CCNY was also the place where I met my wife for 46 years, who's in the audience. We're younger than the folks in that movie. We met in a Hebrew literature class at City College in its embryonic Jewish studies program, and I'll say more about that later on. And I got a chance to play intercollegiate sports, play lacrosse, where I was a legend in my own mind. And I developed, and I'm blessed to have 50-year friendships growing out of that experience. Some of my teammates are in the audience today. And as was indicated by Judy, I gained some recognition as a scholar athlete, which has informed my work. You know what? If you can't be a great sports figure, what do Jews do? You write about it, right? Permit me just give you one quick sports anecdote. I take you to a halftime rant in the bowels of rat-infested Lewiston Stadium during my lacrosse career. Our coach, a great player named George Barron, was of Ukrainian extraction. He wasn't Jewish. And I wasn't playing very well, which was often the case. And he turns to me during halftime and he says, Gurock, there's this encyclopedia of Jews and sports. I'm in it. You're never going to be in it. I didn't think it was that funny. Okay. But how did George Barron get into this encyclopedia of Jews and sports? Because the assumption was when a man with that name who went to City College in the 40s had to be a Jew. And by the way, in their desire, early American Jewish historians, to find any person who was Jewish to put in these large encyclopedias, they chose George Barron. So I guess retrospectively, I got back at George Barron by writing 2 books about Judaism and sports. What you just heard for 5 minutes was an expansion of a 2-minute acceptance speech that I gave when I was privileged to win a Townsend Harris Medal in 2015. It gave me 2 minutes. But I want you to know, the most poignant moment of that dinner was not my speech or the other speeches by these distinguished men and women, but before we spoke, they marched up behind us, the Townsend Harris scholars. They marched behind, young men, young women. One of them was wearing a yarmulke. I didn't know their names. I couldn't pronounce their names. They didn't look like me, but you know, ladies and gentlemen, they were just like me 45 years later. And so I'm clearly and unabashedly a CCNY partisan. Like these young people, I was a first-generation college student. My father desired to be a college student. He thought he'd go to night school, ended up being a fireman. My mother, like many second-generation Jewish women, didn't go to college. She was a bookkeeper. and she worked in the Empire State Building on the 3rd floor. Hey, somebody has to work on the 3rd floor. So I'm a first-generation college student. My wife, a sturdy daughter of City College, is also a first-generation American college student. She's the daughter of a refugee and a survivor. Her father stayed in Germany too long to finish his education. So when these people marched behind me, I thought of them and our lives and their lives, and we are the men and women, the rank and file of City College, of my generation, prior generation. And as you saw in that film, but just a clip, City College remains the same. So I want to talk a little bit about my life at City College and how it reflects some earlier trends in City College history. To begin my perspective, I want to offer a vignette of what took place in Wagner Hall among history majors and faculty in the spring of 1970. 1970 was the year of the Cambodia crisis. Students were gunned down at Kent State. I went to City College. Don't listen to this, President. We had 3 riots in 4 years. On the agenda of faculty and students was a negotiation between us about how to end the semester. Should we have pass-fail grades? Should we have finals? Should we have take-home exams? That was on the agenda while the country was ablaze, and there was a packed house of students. But missing from that deliberation were many of Bernard Bellish's radical students who signed up along with me for his course on the history of American progressivism. They wanted to study with Bellish because he was the old master of the 1930s. Bernard Bellish was a member of the Old Left, of the anti-Stalinist Alcove #1. You'll hear more about that later on today. These are people who wanted to change the world during the 1930s, although they weren't exactly sure how to do it. Later on, during World War II, Professor Bellish was not a conscientious objector. In fact, he landed on Omaha Beach, which changed his life a little bit. And he had great sympathy in contemporary times for those students who had put themselves on the line in opposing the war. For those minimum of radical students, discussing grades while the city and country was ablaze was an irrelevancy. Queens College students a day earlier had blocked the LIE. The revolution was on us. They're battling with construction workers. Many of you who are sports fans remember when Willis Reed on May 8, 1970, walked out and led the Knicks to a championship. Did you know that earlier in the day, there was a riot down on Wall Street with hard hats beating up on the kids? So that's their point of view. Where were the rest of us? Almost all of us opposed the war, although you should know there was an ROC group on campus. There was the Young Americans for Freedom, and there was a continuation of generations-long battle to rid City College of the ROTC. What were we concerned with? We were concerned with our privileged 2S status and free tuition, but we were not interested in putting ourselves on the line. What can we say about the majority of CCNY students? Still 75% Jewish. Well, the New York Times has an article written by a CCNY professor who was very sympathetic towards the radical element within the student body. And he said most students, the majority, their prime concern was mobility to get a professional skills. And most of the City College students protested. Then they climbed into the subways and returned home by night. It remained for Professor Fred L. Israel to say at that meeting, as only he could say, that worrying about grades during a revolution is as if your house is on fire and you rush in to save a bar of soap. That was Fred Israel's perspective. For myself, I always went to the rallies that half filled the Great Hall, but I remained a careerist. Others, as my kids would see, TMI, too much information, it was also a libertine time with social mores in flux. I shan't go into more details about that. This personal experience about a minority of very committed radical students, a majority of students who shared their point of view but were concerned about their grades and professional status, reflected a tradition within City College, which I perceive going back into the 1930s, which, by the way, the first quarter or half of Arguing the World, which you must watch, documents. And that is that unquestionably, almost all CCNY men, and they're all men at that point, were the children of immigrants. We were working class people, first generation college students, and the atmosphere clearly was highly politicized, with varying forms of radicalism permeating the campus. And rising for the cause were the activists, even if they disagreed constantly on how to change the world. They were concerned about strikers in coal mines in Western Pennsylvania. They were concerned about the Scottsboro boys. There was anti-war sentiment permeated the campus. So many students at City and elsewhere signed the Oxford Pledge, which said, we will not go to war again. We're outlawing war as a part of governmental activity. But how pervasive was the commitment of, you excuse the expression, the rank and file of students? Irving Kristol would write, because of the kind of students we were, at least 85 to 90% Jewish, from working class families, possessed of some degree of radicalism in their family traditions, that the entire student body was to one degree or another political, but most were passive politically. The active types numbered in the hundreds, not the thousands. Witness the case of a frustrated radical named Harry Madoff. He entered City College in 1931. He immediately subscribed to alcove number 2, the Stalinist alcove. And you'll see in the movie, I won't give it away, go watch the movie, okay? He joined the Youth League Against War and Fascism, led to rallies at City College against the autocratic President Robinson, who waded into the crowd with his umbrella hitting the students. They fought back. He wasn't expelled, Madoff was expelled. His classmates were in school. It was highly competitive in terms of classwork. People listened to what was said in the alcoves, but went off the class and maybe to 3 jobs to survive the Depression. One non-Marxist student would say of Magdorf and his comrades, the communists in the student body, although only a handful, were the most dedicated and aggressive missionaries, challenging teachers and deans whenever the occasion presented itself, while trying to influence relentless, skeptical, and indifferent fellow students. The best that can be said about the rank and file is that people kept to their books, but they could not help absorbing the climate of ideas that pervaded the campus. So it was a left-wing campus. And yet, there was an ROTC group on campus, which leads me to the following trivia question, which is not so trivial. Can you tell me which college in the United States before World War II had the largest ROC contingent? The answer, our own beloved City College. Even as it is a radical campus, there is a right-wing element. There's a man named Milton Weiner from the Bronx. In 1940, I don't know him, I was unable to track down his family. In 1940, he was honored by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Nicht einer von unserer, if you know Yiddish. For those who don't know Yiddish, not one of us, to say the least. He came from the Bronx. I didn't know him, but he came from the same neighborhoods that produced the Irving House, the Irving Crystals, and the like. After 1938, by the way, the situation on campus begins to change significantly. After Kristallnacht, there's an issue for Jewish radicals about how Jewish they want to be, as opposed to how universal they want to be. Universalism permeated the campus. But after the Anschluss and after the decimation of Czechoslovakia and then after Kristallnacht, if you look at Microcosm, our yearbook, which I did, you begin to see a certain degree of change, a greater sense of people looking at themselves in more parochial terms. And as far as the post office and fire department is concerned, they stole my line from A.M. Rosenthal about the option was either going to City College or go into the post office. Did you know that in 1932, 38,000 people took the exam for 1,200 spots in the police department? Many of them Jewish, many of them graduates of City College. So you could have that diploma and also end up at the City College. So what was the issue that galvanized students constantly, that the radicals picked up on and ran with effectively? The issue was, you know the slogan, our position, no tuition, right? The no tuition. In 1932, the student body in the campus wrote, the establishment of fees would vigorously cripple our enviable reputation for intellectual vigor and transform our beautiful college, renowned for its mental ability, to become a step nearer to one of the country club establishments. And I'll put in parentheses, where Jews couldn't get into at that point. It is necessary to say that this campaign to keep City College free of tuition not only helped City College students, but we know this as partisans of City College, but helped all mankind. In 1929, a graduate of the Townsend Harris High School, one of 200 students who earned that coveted spot, entered City College. He was a grind. He joined no clubs. He held no offices. He won no honors. He played no sports and made no lifelong friends. But in 1955, he earned the international reputation as the man who saved children. His name was Jonas Salk. He's one of our alumni. He's not one of the 8 alumni who won the Nobel Prize, but growing up in the 50s, we still remembered, I'm younger than some of the people here, the scourge of polio. I think that Jonas Salk was rated one of the most important Americans of the 20th century. He's our guy in college. Now, my talk is supposed to be the sturdy men of City College and eventually the daughters. So let me say a word about women at City College. There are no women at City College until well into the 1940s. So let me talk about Hunter College, our sister institution, since that was part of my time lag. Most Jewish women, like my mom, didn't go to college, but if they did, they went to Hunter College, and a small number sneaked into Barnard. Lucy Shelkret Davidowitz, future great Holocaust historian, wrote about her experiences as a student at Hunter College. She was a member of the Young Communist of Hunter College. She wrote, the League took precedence over our classes, especially required courses, which we cut a lot. We were in search of a utopian solution to earthly ills, nothing less than a secular version of the eternal Jewish striving for a messianic world. My particular vision was colored red, the color of blood and revolution. But we were a tiny minority of this body, and she was deeply offended by the students who kept their noses in their books and wanted to have fun, including the 17 sororities and the senior hop that took place while the world was ablaze in the 1930s. One other important career item, many of the women at Hunter College aspired to be school teachers. And if you had on your record that you were arrested for a protest, that was your last moment of getting into the teaching profession. By the way, they also didn't like the accents that our women students spoke with. So now when I speak not with an accent. I speak with a Bronx dialect. Look how far we've come. One final word, I'm running too late. A projection onto contemporary College of New York. Students pay tuition, albeit manageable, but they have an advantage over us. Excuse me. CCNY today embraces multicultural, ethnic, and racial identity. Back in the day, sure, it was a cheder on the hill, but the faculty and administration disdained the backgrounds of its students. In Arguing the World, one of the spokesmen says that because looked at the faculty as no accounts. In my view, they weren't no accounts. They were arch assimilationists. They wanted people to give up their accents, their background, their orientation. By the time we got there, in the 60s and 70s, the faculty became neutral on ethnic and racial identities. Bellish became more Jewish, perhaps internally because of his World War II experience, though his identity ultimately was universal. Now, as far as Jewish studies was concerned, we're here at the Center for Jewish History. Jewish studies was part of the Department of Classical Languages and Hebrew, where we studied Jewish subjects under that rubric. And eventually, Jewish studies becomes a department at City College. This isn't often said, but I'm willing to say this. We Jews rode on the back favorably of the part of Black and Latino students to have Black and Latino studies. So Jewish students said, and faculty, why not us as well? Today's students are benefit from city's largesse, and also a place where the identities are respected and promoted, which makes, to my mind, City College a very special place, even if today a minority of Jews are enrolled in the school. Although I'm told that with the Macaulay program, their numbers are increasing. And without being triumphant, I have to say, it makes sense. Jews do well on exams. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gurock. That was wonderful. All right, we are getting ready for the next segment of our program, a panel discussion moderated by Joe Berger, class of 1966, with CCNY alumni Vivian Gornick, class of 1957, Ralph Blumenthal, class of 1963, and Sid Davidoff, class of 1960. Unfortunately, Irina Klepfish was not well today and was not able to join us, which is too bad. The highlights of the panelists' considerable accomplishments since graduating are in your program, so I'm going to do this quite quickly. Our moderator, Joe Berger, began his journalism career as a student reporter for the campus. He worked for New York and the New York Post before he went on to become a reporter, editor, and columnist during a 30-year career at the New York Times. A Townsend Harris Medalist, he is the recipient of numerous journalism awards and the author of 4 books, including his wonderful memoir, Displaced Persons, Growing Up American After the Holocaust, which will also be on sale here during the break. Ralph Blumenthal was editor-in-chief of the campus and a stringer for the New York Times at City College, where he majored in English. After graduation, he went to Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and went on to the Times, where he worked for the next 45 years. He's also a Townsend Harris Medalist, and Ralph is the author of many books, 2 of which will be on sale here after the break. Sid Davidoff grew up in Queens and attended Baruch College, also known as CCNY downtown at that time. He was a member of the City College wrestling team, active in student government. And among his many college credentials, he served as administrative assistant to New York Mayor John Lindsay for 7 years. He was one of 20 people on Nixon's enemies list. And he made an appearance on an episode of The Sopranos, so sort of fun. And Vivian Gornick is a renowned memoirist, essayist, and biographer. Born in the Bronx, she received her BA from City College and her MA from NYU. She's the author of 12 books, and star just keeps on rising. She was recently profiled in New York Magazine's The Cut in an article titled, "Vivian Gornick Doesn't Get the Hype." So maybe she'll talk about that. So now please join me in welcoming our panel to the stage. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank Judy Ban for organizing this. Just done a wonderful job. and Jeffrey for that wonderful introduction. Unfortunately, I've got to say, I was in ROTC for a year. It'll give you a sense of what City College was like. I was a Bronx kid. I was a Bronx kid. I didn't know my way around the college. My folks hadn't gone to college. And I showed up for club week where you kind of try to figure out which clubs you want to join. And somebody came over to me with a uniform and said, "You want to be a mama's boy the rest of your life?" And so I joined ROTC. And I think the Pershing Rifles for a short time too. So, okay. To understand what City College once meant to the Jews of New York, you have to realize that a century and even a half a century ago, Jews were a very different tribe. We live at a time when Jews have, at various times, been presidents of practically all the Ivies, partners in white shoe law firms, 1/3 of the members of the Supreme Court, and even now, leading the impeachment of a president. We think of Jews as doctors, professors, hedge fund entrepreneurs, novelists, not as blue-collar workers, but in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, and even into the 1960s, the picture was very different. Lots of Jews, like my parents, worked in factories, most prominently in the garment center, the ultimate the schmatte trade, as operators, cutters, pressers, where there were locksmiths, postal clerks, owners of candy stores and luncheonettes, civil servants of various kinds. Some even rose to become public school teachers and principals. Many still spoke the Yiddish they imported from Eastern Europe and Russia, and had memories of pogroms and after World War II of cattle cars and gas chambers. Jews, in short, were heavily working class, and for a lot of them, college was indeed the shining city on the hill, particularly at a time of quotas at some of the elite colleges, and because those private colleges were quite costly. So City College was the shining city on the hill, the springboard that enabled them, or more frequently their children, to enter the middle class and the professions, into a life of the mind and the arts, towards more chances for comfort, leisure, and even luxury. In a little more than 50 years, it produced a breathtaking list of accomplished people in a variety of fields, including scientists like Jonas Salk, Andrew Grove, and Leon Letterman, political and government officials like Felix Frankfurter, Abe Beam, Ed Koch, intellectuals like Irving Howe, Daniel Bell, Nathan Glazer, Joseph Stiglitz, journalists like Abe Rosenthal and Marvin Kalb, and entertainment icons like Ira Gershwin, Edward G. Robinson, Yip Harburg, who wrote Over the Rainbow, Jackie Mason, Patty Chayefsky, and Stanley Kubrick, the great director. Its alumni garnered more PhDs than any college except Berkeley, and it produced 10 Nobel Prize winners.
You left out Julius Rosenberg.
Let me get to that. Ralph, who was my editor at college, just took a line away from me.
Sorry about that, Joe.
All right. I'm trying to turn the pages. Now, how CCNY became this phenomenal engine of transformation and what memories it left us are the subjects of our panel, that our panel will grapple with today. And we have several distinguished graduates with us. So let me start by asking the following question. For those audience who did not attend City College, I'd like to begin by asking, what was it about the City College experience that made it distinctive, that made it different than other colleges? For the audience, for those in the audience who didn't go to City College. So I thought we'd tell them a little bit about what made it different than other colleges.
Well,
it's a Passover question, Manishana.
It's a rhetorical question.
Open-ended.
Actually, I'm going to hit a diverging note here. I grew up in the Bronx. Jewish, working class, immigrant, all the rest of it. We all had the same background. But in my house, class reigned over Jewishness. My parents were left-wingers, and they were very secular. I grew up inside Yiddishkeit, but in fact, the class that we came from was the most important thing in the house. When I got to City College, the most important thing for me was the recognition of all these working class kids who were there along with me. I knew something of the history of City College. My brother, who was 6.5 years older than me, he'd gone to City and had loved it. And indeed, he imbued the whole household with the love of City College. And as I have said, and thousands before and after me have said, for us, it was City College or nothing. And we think of it as being deprived. We thought it was a privilege to get into the school because I think it was because we were working class and we knew that that was the road to the promised land, that education. And I also knew that City was indeed mainly for the working class, not for Jews in particular. It's true, of course, in our generations, most people were, but there were Italians and Irish there, and they were among my friends. I felt either Jewish or a girl when I was at City College. Those categories seemed to melt into the air. And that is my major memory. I don't remember the school as being profoundly political either. We were the silent generations. And we were exactly, as has been said, what's my position? Free tuition. We were immensely involved with doing well, with getting out. Another thing I want to say is that the faculty was not distinguished, not in my time. We were distinguished. It was the students who gave City its power. My memory of the fast-talking, intellectual-minded kids is supreme. I too have never seen another place where there was such a fever of intellectual ambition. Not that we were intellectually distinguished, but we were on fire with the life of the mind. And that's what City meant to me more than anything else, that it gave me that for the rest of my life.
I don't want to let that stand, Vivian. I want to take issue with you on the faculty. But first I want to say, I didn't consider City particularly Jewish because I came from a Jewish neighborhood in Inwood, and that was pretty much the world. So I didn't feel I was in a new milieu when I came to City. That was sort of just the way things were. But Joe, you asked what the college meant to each of us, and you'll see in the film that so much of the learning at City College went on outside the classroom at clubs and arguments and in the alcoves. So it was said at the time that people majored in cafeteria. And I consider, in my case, I majored in the campus, which was the newspaper. And I'll just tell a brief story because so much of the rest of my life was dependent on the things I learned at the campus, quite apart from the courses at City College. In a club period, I like to say I got my job at the New York Times, but I was paper trained at the City College. I wandered into the campus offices, 338 Finley, if you remember. It was a hellhole. There was coffee splashed all over, cigarette butts on the floor, paper strewn all over. I thought it was paradise. It looked great. And one day, one of the editors, Bruce Solomon, came in. He had a term paper due that day, and he came in, and he looked over the typewriters in the campus office, picking the typewriter with the large face, so you'd have to write less. And he sat down at that typewriter, and he pounded out his term paper, and I said, if that's what journalists can do, this is for me. That really, it shaped my life. We took it very seriously. I'm going to show you, maybe there's a picture I can put up of, is that, yep. Our sainted President Buell Gallagher was with us for a while, then he left to go to California, then he came back. But this is the newspaper that we devoted ourselves to. We took it very, very seriously. Joe was on it, Clyde Haberman, who might be in the audience, was on it, Marvin Kalb, who wrote up the basketball scandal was on it. So a lot of interesting alumni. But anyway, it was a wonderful experience, and I'll talk a little more about that later.
So I probably grew up a little bit differently than the rest of the panel. I grew up in an area that was non-Jewish. I was one of the only Jewish kids in the area, and I was fortunate enough that I graduated. I came out of the 8th grade to go to high school at 12 and had no idea what life was about. And my parents had no education. Owned a candy store. We either lived above or behind the candy store, depending where the candy store was at the time. I got to go to Jamaica High School by taking Hebrew. At that time, each borough had one school that you could in that borough. If you took Hebrew, you could go out of your area. That changed my life to get into City College. So I'm 16. I get out of high school, and the quote before was either City College or a post office. To me, it was City College or the military. There was just no way. I was a tough kid, and would have, had I stayed in my area of South Queens and Jackson, I don't know what would have happened to me in the crowd that I was with. But I then got into City College, didn't think anything about it. Like you, Jewish, not Jewish, it was a place that I could get to by the subway. It was affordable. I remember it being $50, not $37, but you know what?
We complained about it.
Yeah, we always complain about it, but that was the student dues. At any rate, at City College, I learned, and it was the first time that I really understood it wasn't about how fast you can get out, and you can really learn something. And I was fortunate enough to have a political science teacher who was a mentor of mine, who brought John Lindsay down while I was a student, and my career went from there. He came down to speak. He was running for Congress as an insurgent against the organization, Republican organization. I'm this kid from Queens. I look at him, the 6-foot blonde, Buckley, Yale, and I said, wow. And he was saying everything I thought, and I said, that's where I want to be with him for the rest of my life, and I did. So to me, and also by the fact that I was able to then participate in his campaign, become a right hand to him, so to speak, do the things that no one else in his district would, because the silk stocking district, I was willing to do the scut jobs that nobody wanted, and it changed my life. So my 4 years at, actually 3.5, I graduated early. My 3.5 years at City College, to me, was very special. It meant my whole future was based upon the day that he came in, that my political science teacher took me under her wing, introduced me to the life of the city, and made me who I am today. I just want to add to that, as I said, to me, it wasn't a Jewish school. It was pretty much people like me, people who couldn't afford to go to another school, who wanted to learn, who needed an education, who really wanted to get out and become something. I think those who I associated with were very much like me. It wasn't about Jewishness. It was about the importance of that college education to get on to the next step.
But one of the things that made City College different than, let's say, schools outside the city was that you went to school by subway and you slept at home with,
Yes.
in your parents' home.
That was really important.
How did that affect the college experience?
That's very important. That is very important. Most people associate going to college with going away from home and growing up in an atmosphere where you fend for yourself and do not have the comforts and the support of home. With us, it was a variant on that. We all, as you say, we were all subway students. We all went home, and every night we slept in our home in the beds that we grew up in. However, in my experience, and the same for everybody I knew, we were still in the household, but we were no longer of the household. We were living in our head then, and that was a remarkable split, which everyone negotiated. And when I thought back on it for years later, how brilliantly that happened, that we were at one and the same time. We both remained kids, and we were no longer kids. And what was most important was going on inside of our minds. And that influenced the kinds of quarrels we had with our parents.
Right. Well, I think one of the reasons that we went to a subway school for many kids, not all kids, but for many kids, was that our parents really didn't want us to go out of town.
Well, yeah,
And,
there's no question of that.
and they weren't going to spend the money for Columbia.
No, there was no.
I think a lot.
So for example, in my case, my folks were Holocaust survivors, so they didn't have much family here.
Speaking of Mike.
My folks were Holocaust survivors, didn't have much family here.
Right.
So, there was no option of being town.
No, not for us
It was
either.
either Columbia or City College, and I didn't get into Columbia.
Yeah.
I think it also depended on the kind of relationship you had with your parents. If there was a generational divide, or if your parents didn't understand what you were doing at City College, it might have led to conflict. I happen to have a very supportive, home life, and my parents, nurtured my studies, and we had good discussions at home. So I don't remember much conflict. My father even gave me the cards at night, and I'd come home at 4 a.m. and hand him the keys because he was off on his salesman route at 4 a.m. And he would say to me, "Coming or going?" And I often didn't. I often didn't know. But I think in my case, and I think in probably a lot of our cases, it was a real plus to have a home to come back to every day and to engage with the family and get that feedback. Perhaps in other cases, it wasn't true that way.
Yeah.
No, another.
No, I didn't have a family.
Okay.
And
No.
when my father owned the candy store, as I said, he worked 18 hours a day. My mother worked with him when she wasn't doing stuff at the home. It was no relationship where we would have that kind of discussion. My discussions came with my fellow students. It was them that I hung out with after school and so on. Very much although downtown city did not have a camp, had one floor where the students met and had their clubs and so on. But that floor was very important because that's where I learned to think.
Yeah. Well, in my case, we were girls. We were among the first generations that were admitted to City College, right? So actually, maybe it was a self-selective matter. Me and most of my friends, we were all doing things that confused our parents. For instance, she thought a girl goes into crosses one door marked college, comes out another door marked teacher. Yeah, and when I graduated and I wasn't a teacher, she felt swindled. She said to me, "What have you been doing there all these years?" And I said, "Reading novels." And she thought I was, it was not. So there was and my mother was intelligent and she was ambitious for us. However, when I started using words that she didn't understand, she said, "What are you talking about? Speak English. Everybody here understands English." But it was no longer the English of the household that I was speaking. And that was tremendous separation. There were other people I knew, their parents didn't know what the hell they were studying, and they were just as confused when they got out. So to a large extent, maybe not to a large extent, but to a significant extent, there were people like us who fell into tremendous conflict with our parents and was like, we were the Americanizing generation. I couldn't understand why my mother objected to anything I said. After all, I was taking her into the promised land, wasn't I? I was what it was all about, but it wasn't that simple.
I want to just say how much of the learning at City went on at the fringes of the traditional college experience. At the campus, we had discussions about popular culture when The Iceman Cometh was on TV, two-part educational television series.
With Jason Robards.
Jason Robards as Hickey. We watched that riveted. It was our first exposure to O'Neill. And we would be quoting the lines back and forth. Every day we come into the newspaper office and say, "You took the life out of the booze, Hickey." And when the Alexandria Quartet came out, Lawrence Durrell's started in 57, I think it finished in 90. It mesmerized us, and all we would talk about is the purple prose of Lawrence Durrell. And I'd haul myself back along the iron chains of memory, and we all try to copy that in our writing. So much of the life at City, it seems to me, was the learning from colleagues and in my case at the campus, which was a really fierce intellectual.
Right. Well, I think we all of us at the college, we're really eager to be educated, sophisticated, Americanized. You know, we wanted, in our case, we wanted to, kind of get the Bronx out of our system, the Bronx and Brooklyn out of our system, and get involved with Humphrey Bogart movies and jazz and W.C. Fields and be, kind of a hip American. And I think there was a lot of that because, we came from these working class homes where there wasn't as much contact with that cultivated world. And then I think we were trying to be more so.
I think we also learned conflict. City College specialized in that. Conflict with the administration. I mean, that was built in, I know, in that era. Jeffrey talked about the 70s, and a little earlier it was conflict over a speaker ban that they had at City College. Board of Ed decided they were going to, they wanted the right to decide who would speak at our gatherings. A fiercely contested issue. So we fought with the administration a lot, and that's one of the great things I take away from my City College experience. And I'll see if I can put that up. We found innovative ways of tweaking the establishment. The student government, one group put up the student higher integrity ticket. And is that the right? Sorry. There we go. The student higher integrity ticket, and we.
By the way, notice the byline in the left-hand corner. Go ahead.
And you're on that. You're in that issue too, Joe. But we had Dean. What I say we had a Dean James Peace, Dean of Student Life, who we fought with continuously. Some of you may remember him. And we got to explain why the student higher integrity ticket was inappropriate because the initials couldn't be used in polite conversation. And we made a whole point of getting him to say that. So we had our conflicts. And maybe this was part of the Jewish culture at City College, being disputatious, but we really learned, I mean, we honed our debate skill, our fighting skills, fighting with the administration all the time. And especially Buell Gallagher, who was a great civil libertarian and a very, very progressive figure. He'd run a African-American college in the South before coming to City College. He had a blind side when it came to left-wing activities at City College. So there was a lot of conflict with him. And he was a very tough opponent, a difficult guy to confront. So that was part of the education at City,
right,
too.
well, how were the rest of you affected by the activist spirit at the college? We talked before about the alcoves, the Marxist and Stalinist alcoves. Those were gone by the time we were there.
Before us. Those men were 30s and 40s.
No, right. But there was still an activist spirit at the college. There was civil rights demonstrations. There were Vietnam.
Not much. It was the keynote speaker said. No, that was not my experience. We were all familiar with every single strain on the left, every one, across the sociological board. And there were people there. When I went to school, Robert Shear was there. He was the first editor of Ramparts and a very left-wing journalist for all these years. So Bobby was very hot on left-wing issues there. And he would grab hold of me and say, "What's the matter with you? You come from a left-wing home. Why aren't you interested in this anymore?" But those differences were very powerful. I wasn't anymore. I was into literature by then, and I was not into politics. And most of the people I knew were like me. I did not experience a great political atmosphere. I experienced what you've experienced, mostly that we were intensely urgent about becoming what we thought we were going to become. And that was a really melding into the American life. that is really the history of City College. It has served every single ethnic immigrant, every kind, working class, every kind of outsider population in the city, mostly working class, generation after generation and ethnicity after ethnicity. When I grew up and a writer at the Village Voice, for instance, in the 1970s, I was sent back to City College to write a story on what it was. The story that came out was called City College Wears an Itchy Afro. Because when I was there one day, I saw this kid sink a finger into, he was Jewish, he had a Jewish afro. He sank a finger
in Israel.
and scratched. So by the 70s, it was again a very mixed school. It was open admissions. There were all kinds of, there were Black and Latino and all kinds of people who had not been there before, and another kind of immigrant, Chinese, and I wrote a piece in which I wrote about how different my time had been, and yet at the same time, I thought the college was still serving New York's working class. That was for. When I went to school, I thought Jane Addams could have approved of the atmosphere at City. It was an Americanization process. That's what it was for, and it was thrilling to see how inclusive it became, that it remained and it became. And to this day, I mean, I know a lot of people spent their years teaching at City College, and they love it for this exactly the same reasons. Right. So all we could hear is it was our flavor was Jewish, right. But we were in an historical line that continues to this moment.
Yeah, I think I graduated in January of '60. I think the real change the activism came with the Vietnam War. And that really, just changed. I was at City Hall in those years, Columbia, Kent State, women's movement. It was a whole different thing. To get out in 1960, it was get out of my my law degree and go really make something of myself. But I will say this: the debate wasn't the kind of debate you talk about of the left and right. It was really where, in my experience, was New York City. We're very involved in New York City. Our speakers were, as I said, John Lindsay, Carmine DeSapio. I remember, sitting with this guy who was a legend at the time, the most powerful men in the country. Were brought to our classroom, and we had a chance to talk to. It instilled a desire to be, take on the issues of New York much more so than the wider issues that you're talking about, is my experience.
I think also we were kind of an interim generation. I remember when I entered City College in 1958, we were still considered the silent generation. It was the Eisenhower years, everything was bland. Then when Sputnik went up in '57, just before we got there, everybody wanted to be an engineer. So everybody was, studying to be an engineer and keep their records clean so they could work for the government. And the activism really started in around '68 or so, with the Vietnam War. And so we were kind of in between that. But I don't want to let your comment about the faculty go unanswered.
Well, prove something different.
Okay. I know that you and Irene had, when you left, Irene, who's unfortunately not here, when you left City College, you went on to graduate work, and you felt, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you felt unprepared. You felt unprepared and felt that City hadn't prepared you well enough.
Oh, absolutely.
Anyway, I had the opposite experience. I found the faculty marvelous, especially after in my senior years at City College. As a freshman, you couldn't get into the good courses. They were all taken by the upper class people. But eventually, I had wonderful professors, and I remember them to this day. I had Oscar Sherwin, who taught The Age of Swift and Pope. I can see him, like yesterday. And what happened actually during the semester, and I still remember this vividly, he got mugged on the subway stairs one day, got knocked down by a mugger. Crime was, on the increase in the early '60s. And he had no idea what had happened to him because he lived in the 18th century, and he was living, the age of Jonathan Swift.
That was a rarity.
Well, no, I had John Yohannan, who taught Asian literature. He wrote a
Sweet
book,
guy.
wonderful guy, Iranian, very sweet-natured man. But on and on. I mean, I did an honors English thesis on the poet Robinson Jeffers, and my mentor, and I knew little about him at the time, was William Turner Levy, who I found out later was a great confidant of Eleanor Roosevelt's and a friend of Robinson Jeffers and a real powerhouse. And this guy was and I took a seminar with Alfred Kazin.
One reason that City College had such a great faculty was that it was in New York. And so
Right.
people who wanted to live in New York, professors who wanted to live in New York, wanted to teach at so much. So we had, and also some of them couldn't teach at other colleges, no matter how good they were. They were
Blacklisted.
quotas against Jews or silent quotas against Jews in places like even Columbia University, where Lionel Trilling, I believe, was the first Jewish professor in the literature department.
Bertrand Russell was,
Precisely.
not allowed.
So I think that
I was an English student.
But as a result, we had people like Edgar Johnson, who was the
I know what kind of
Dickens, and George Schwab, who was a wonderful history teacher, and Marvin Magdalena.
Okay, yes, I had all those teachers too. But when I graduated from City and I went to Berkeley to get a higher degree, we were like primitives in that English department. That English department was so much more sophisticated than anything that City College was able to produce. Yes, they gave us reverence. They gave us a great love of literature. They put the books in our hands. They did.
Can you argue better than them, though?
Yes. Eventually I could.
Okay.
That was the whole thing. Yeah. At Berkeley, it was like another world, another planet. So I have to stick to my guns on that one. And they were all good. I mean, it wasn't that they weren't good. It was they were not distinguished. We were not getting a distinguished education. What we were getting was the love of being educated.
Well, they produced a wonderful writer of fear.
Yes,
Compassion,
that's right.
which I recommend highly to all
They
of you.
produced a lot of wonderful people, as
So-
they should have.
Also, the people that City College attracted as speakers, the speaker band notwithstanding, I mean, we had Malcolm X come in, and I got to interview him for the campus. I'll never forget this. And he said to me, and again, I remember this to this day, he said, "Do you know why my color is the way it is?" He had kind of a reddish complexion, a very strange complexion. He said, "Some white man raped my grandmother." Wow. And I put that in the article. And I remember Robert Morgenthau ran for governor, was the worst candidate ever in history, but he came to City College. I got to interview him. So, I mean, City College was that magnet. Everybody came through City College. So we got exposed to these people.
So downtown City College is a little bit different because downtown was you got your degree in accounting or public administration. So it was business administration or public administration. Public administration being the politics in the city. So the teachers there you're talking about a whole nother level when you're talking about your English. English to me was to read whatever you can get through, 3 lines. It wasn't whatever you were saying. So, but we produced a hell of a lot of good accountants. Yeah.
We also had great adjuncts like Patty Chayefsky, the screenwriter of Marty, the wonderful film and Network. He taught a class on screenwriting. Now, he wasn't a great teacher because all he did but he was a great raconteur. So he told a lot of great stories about Hollywood, and we would sit there and listen. Did we learn how to write a screenplay? No. But that was the kind of person who would come to City College. Elie Wiesel taught at City College in the Jewish Studies department. So you had the blessings of those kinds.
Absolutely.
Right.
It was a rich atmosphere.
Right. So how did City College change you? How would you have been a different person if you hadn't gone to City College?
Well, we've all said the same thing, that we can't even imagine how our lives would have gone if we had not come out of City College. But isn't that true for all college students? Wouldn't college students say that of their colleges? It wasn't that it changed us, it was that it gave us the entry to whatever it was we were going to become. I remember the day after I graduated from City College, it was like I jumped off a cliff. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know what graduate school was, much less where to go, what to do. And I remember tramping the streets of the city in a numb state. And my brother said to me, whatever you do, don't learn stenography, right? So, we all know what that meant, right? Keep trying. And I would run into kids that I got that, had graduated with me. And we were all wandering around, not knowing how to find our sea legs or what to do. We hardly knew what graduate school was, at least in my experience. I remember one summer taking a class, and there was a kid, a very good-looking kid, dressed much better than the rest of us, in one of these summer classes. And he was sitting in the back. I was sitting with my friends, and somebody said to me, "Who's that?" And I didn't know. And the girl on my right said, somebody said, "He's from Bard." And the girl on my right said, "Where's that?" And the girl on my left said, "What's that?" So that's where we were. Nevertheless, there was a teacher in that class who was listening to us. He was a visiting teacher, a friend of the teacher. And he said, "My God, these kids, you can't keep them down." Everybody's hand was up, as soon as the teacher stopped talking for a second. So that's what we contributed, and that's mostly how I remember it.
In my case, it really took me out of my shell. I entered City College as an art major from Music and Art High School. I wanted to be an artist, and I didn't have any idea how I would earn a living. It didn't seem very important to me at the time, but on the campus, I immediately had a life direction. And I mentioned something about Buell Gallagher, and I want to tell a quick story. After we'd written an article on the campus that had ticked him off, which happened frequently, it wasn't as bad as the April Fool's issue, by the way, a few years earlier. That got everybody suspended. But we kind of learned a lesson.
Tell them why.
Well, the famous case was, I believe, 1954 or 56. The tradition was to put out an April Fool's issue, both Observation Post, the other newspaper, and the campus. And this particular year, the campus got a little carried away, and they wrote a story, a fictional story, about the campus prostitute.
The campus whorehouse.
They named her Millie Crotch, if you'll pardon me. And the story is, and I got this straight from the horse's mouth from Jack Schwartz, one of our colleagues at the Times, who was there at the time. The story was dummied into the paper of the campus, and at the last minute, they needed a picture. So the printer that we used, All City Printers on the Lower East Side, also printed the Hunter Arrow, the Hunter College Arrow. So they said to Gene, the printer, "We need a cut to go with the story." So he reached in, they pulled out a woman's picture, a cut, for the...
Of an old lady.
An old lady who happened to be Anna Cross, the Commission of Correction. Anyway, but the story, that's not the story. I got a little sidetracked. The story I wanted to tell, and they used her picture, and it was hell to pay. Suspended. It was a huge uproar. The entire editorial board of the campus was suspended. Gallagher was furious, and there was really no good answer for that. It's pretty hard to defend, at least if they'd published an anonymous picture. Anyway, but one day we'd published a story in the campus that Gallagher took exception to, which he often did, and he called me in literally on the carpet of his office, and he said, "Where did you get this information?" And I said, "Well, I looked through the clips of the campus, and we really published that before." And he said, "Let me tell you a story." He said, "There was a little Italian town, and a very poor town, very primitive, and there was only one man in the town who had a watch. And every day at noon, the church bell would ring, and the man with the watch would set his watch exactly to 12 o'clock. And one day, someone asked the priest who rang the church bell, 'How do you know to church bell every day at noon?' And he said, 'I asked the man with the watch.'" So, by which Gallagher was saying that it was circular reasoning, and I was taking the same misinformation from before. Anyway, But the point of the story is we learned at the campus to argue on our feet. And when the president calls you on the carpet, I don't know, Vince, if you do this now all the time, but when the president and Gallagher was a very imposing figure. We called him Lincoln-esque. Every reference to him was always Lincoln-esque. He was 6 foot something and very austere and former minister. Anyway, when the president calls you on the carpet and starts chewing you out, you have to have something to say back. So I kind of learned, I'm not saying I was brilliant, but I said something. And that was a real education. So that's what City taught me.
It's a lot.
That City changed you. Go ahead.
What did you say?
So how did City change you, Sid?
As I said, you know, the meeting of John Lindsay, the mentorship of my professor, it really raised in me the desire to be part of the city. That you know, I couldn't wait to get out there and change the way it was. You see, you know, you grow up like we grew up. You see all the things that need changing. And it was the law school gave me my education to put myself in the position, but it really was City College that gave me the heart and desire to do what we had to do. So it was, you know, if I can't imagine. Well, let's face it, it would have been the military. Who knows what I would have done in the military? But I couldn't imagine not having City College and having the opportunities it gave me.
Was there an elitist tinge to your going to City College? After all, you had to have like an 87, 88 average. You were doing, you know, you were, and did that affect your relation with your neighbors, with your family?
I was the only girl on my block to go to college. When we went, most of the homes of the girls I was growing up with, girls and boys alike, was the girl got out of school and had taken the commercial course and was headed for short-term secretaryship and then get married. My mother was the only woman on the block who said, the girl is clever and she's going to school. And that was it, yeah. No, most people did not, right? I mean, everybody I knew at City was one among the few of the way we all grew up.
There was a lot of prestige to go into City then. I think so, a lot of prestige. It was not, you know, like, oh, you're going to a city school, a subway school. City College had a very high reputation then, still does, or does again, I should say, after all the Sturm und Drang of recent years. But I think it was high prestige.
Yeah, my neighborhood, my sister, my older sister, it was actually she took commercial course in high school and went on to become a secretary. You know, that was the normal thing. Or you did get an education and became a teacher. Right. And certainly in the 60s, that was the case. You became a teacher. There wasn't many other openings for you. I want to tell one story that has nothing to do with this.
We're going to take some questions.
But Bella Rabzug, because we're talking about the time of the activism of women, Bella Rabzug became a very good friend of mine. She told me the story. You know, she used to wear big hats with the big brims. And she said the reason she did that is when she became a lawyer, she's one of the few women lawyers at the time, and she would walk into, and she was with a large firm, and it would be a bunch of lawyers sitting there going over whatever, that real estate deal, whatever. She'd be the only woman, they'd ask her for coffee or to take notes or something. And she had to separate herself from the crowd, and that's why she wore the big hats. What that has to do with this, I have no idea.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from the audience now. So,
Jeffrey Gurock is going to come back on the stage now.
I'd like to hear about what you feel as a City College graduate, your social responsibility, not only to yourself, your family, and your community. As someone mentioned, I went to City College of Kent State, the war in Vietnam, open admission, and we protested. And we protested realizing that our parents had come, we were privileged to be college students, but now we had a responsibility to others. So I'd like to hear your feeling about being the city college, the children of immigrants, and what our responsibility is now and into the future.
Well, I think the responsibility is to keep fighting for return to free tuition, or at least moderate tuition, to keep those standards that we held so high. I mean, we didn't talk at all about the fight over open admissions, which was a real hot issue for all graduates of City College and the society at large, but to maintain high standards, even with the need to be more inclusive. So I think we have a responsibility to offer the next generations the gifts we received.
So I have about 14 comments to make about this panel. All good, by the way. By the way, when I was at City, Buell G. Gallagher, the G stood for God, okay? Your question about social consciousness. It's rare. Can you hear me? Is my mic on? Okay, fine. It's interesting. It's rare when I'm on a panel that I'm the youngest participant these days, okay?
Thanks a lot.
So I arrived at City College half a generation after my colleagues here. So I think Ralph mentioned it was a transitional era. You folks went during the years of the Eisenhower administration, the optimism of the early Kennedy years, et cetera. So I arrived, along with my colleagues, in an era of the Vietnam War, as was mentioned here, but also something about our city that should be mentioned that I've written about recently, and that is white folks should understand that our city, for the longest time, was a very segregated city. And until 1968, 69, City College, it was a rarity that you saw an African-American face or Latino face, et cetera. So as a white person, the open admission struggle raised my consciousness because I grew up in a neighborhood which was also light. So I think it's informed my writings. It's also informed my consciousness in terms of the fact that our city, if it is to progress, should be a multicultural, multiracial city. And that was one of the gifts, ironically, that all the turmoil at City College gave to me. One last thing about teachers and faculty. When you ask students today or back in the day who go to these great universities, did you ever study with Professor X, Y, and Z? And they said, oh yeah, I had a TA who did most of the teaching. And when I was a senior, maybe I was lucky enough to be in this person's class. Each department is different, each experience is different. But I was fortunate, and I mentioned just two of them, Bellish and Israel and Irving Rosenthal, who worked with students. They weren't prolific writers, they weren't rarefied professors. But I remember Bellish's class, 13 weeks, you wrote 13 papers. Every week you wrote a short paper, copious criticism, etc. So I think that experience there helped me when I ended up going to Columbia for my graduate work. So kudos for them. And finally, Irving Rosenthal produced generations of journalists who came out of City College, who've made their mark on the New York scene. So kudos for them. Thanks a lot.
Next question, Ron.
In the fine traditions of City College, I disagree with a lot of what was said, but I do agree with Vivian. My experience with the teachers was that there were some good ones. I was not impressed overall. And it was highlighted when I got to NYU Law School, where every teacher was great. And they had not trained as teachers. So that was a big revelation for me. But I think one of the important things we need to take note of about the Jewishness of City College is that for all of its times, it was not an imposed religious experience. It was a circumstantial background experience. And the Jews who were on campus never politicized or pushed the Jewishness. They did to the extent where you wanted Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur off, but it was not an imposition on the rest of the people there. what it did do for us is it gave us that intellectual curiosity and the contentiousness. And so we need to thank our religion for that and note it for that. But we also need to tell people we did not make this into a Jewish place and impose that on others. It just happened to be that way.
My soulmate. About the social responsibility part, that's an interesting question. Everybody that I knew, everybody there, we came from places that had made us familiar with all of these ideas, every idea of social injustice, all the ideas, all there inside us. Everyone who took every position under the sun at City was familiar to everybody else. But for the most part, we were not impelled to go out and crusade. Many of us turned out, as it happens, as the years went on, to become activists of one sort or another, including the excitement, the marvelousness of being devoted to New York City itself. That was a thrill to see that. Lots of people from City became part of city government one time or another, and experienced that, the eloquence of loving the city and wanting to do something for it. And above all, the John Lindsay years were among the best. And there were lots of people from City who came out, who just traveled that route. You know, it was all familiar. None of it. When I got to Berkeley, they never heard of a communist. They never heard of almost anything. I mean, I felt like I was arriving from another planet, and that it was my responsibility to acquaint the rest of the country with the idea of New York Jewish communists. But at City College, nobody had to acquaint anybody with anything. It was all there.
At Berkeley, you had to educate them about the politics of the left.
Right.
Well, that was long before the Berkeley you're talking about.
Well,
I'd also add to what Ron said, without being too psychological. I think many of us didn't talk much about our Jewish backgrounds, our Holocaust backgrounds. You know, we were interested. We were presenting a new persona to the world, like college kids. We were developing our personas. And I think we wanted to be American. We wanted to be sophisticated. And so you didn't talk about that much about your homes, your backgrounds. So I think that's why it wasn't an overtly Jewish place that way.
yeah, but I object to the idea about imposing Judaism on other students. What I was suggesting is that if you wanted to maintain your Jewish values, whatever they were, that City College, until recently, did not provide you with that way of looking at it. Going back in time, there is a book called City College and the Jewish Poor, which was written 20 years ago, which starts the time period before any of us, where the professors were openly dismissive of Jewish culture of any sort. And then you go to an era where if you're Jewish and of a traditional mindset like myself, that Jewish holidays and Jewish observances were not countenanced. And finally, the city recognizes Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but there's still issues. I think the good thing about City College today and the positive aspect of a multicultural identity is that if you want to maintain your heritage, that thing is hallowed, not a question of something that you have to reject. But people who want to maintain their identity also should not try to impose it on anybody else. That's the calculus that we have to deal with constantly in the city.
I heard many references to the Vietnam War. It seems that all of you in one fashion or another were influenced by it. I didn't even want to talk about the civil rights, which was the other great political event of our times. And I'm wondering, I know that the conventional civil rights movement did not particularly take place in New York. I was living in Texas at the time and was very conscious of it, more so than Vietnam War. But I'm wondering, were there any people from City who went to the South or in any way got involved in the civil rights movement?
Well,
Bus tours to the South every summer. The kids at City were probably more involved in the civil rights movement than they were even in the Vietnam thing, because the civil rights movement began in a big way before that. It was the two big pushes for the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam.
It was just striking.
But
to me.
the civil rights movement was south of the Mason-Dixon line. So in a sense, it's easy for New Yorkers to get us and go down to Selma. No. Absolutely, believe me, I understand the tragedy of that. What I'm saying is, this is not washing up on your shores in your city. But I'm also suggesting it takes a while for Jews and other whites to deal and confront what morphs from civil rights down south to black power up north.
Ross Barnett spoke in college in the Great Hall of 1963. Everybody knows about that.
Again, protesting Ross Barnett makes sense. It's not washing up on your shores. Question is, how do you deal with something like 1969, 1970, teacher strike in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, a different era, a different situation. So you always have to look at the time frame that you're talking about and where it's going on within your city and in the nation, which is getting us away from City College, but an interesting point of view nonetheless.
It doesn't get us away from city. The city, we were there before, had the biggest population of black people in the night program.
In the night program.
In the evening program.
Right.
I started, my first year was at night in the city, and there were many, many blacks in that. I don't know the percentages, half, quarter, whatever, but it was very significant. And so if city ever looks at how many blacks it educated, we saw the films of the 30s and 40s, you saw people sitting there. If city looks at what it did for black people, it will see much more benefit there than we realize. The other side of the coin that you're talking to is right. There were so many levels of discrimination that even though you were fighting top levels, there was still much that remained. But you've got to put it in balance. City had a big effort for civil rights despite the structural discrimination.
You know, I don't remember that particularly, Ron, but I will say that the famous or infamous basketball team of 1950 was integrated, and the players roomed together, and so City College did practice what it preached in terms of inclusiveness.
You don't remember the bus rides to the South?
I don't. I really don't.
Yeah.
I remember the campus covered a lot of the protests about Latino studies, lack of Latino studies, and other diversity, but anyway.
Hispanic University requested by professor for Spanish community in New York City.
What year is that?
1962.
Early, right? Interesting. That led to Hostos, I think.
May I interrupt now?
Say something about the 1930s. I entered City College.
Like in City College, right?
I entered City College in 1934 as a very innocent person. Just graduated from Morris High School. And we came into the chapel, which was held at noon at 12 o'clock every week. And then one of the first chapels was the welcome to the 16 students from Italy who were visiting the United States. And the president of City College was welcoming them. The president with the umbrella.
Frederick Robinson.
And as he was speaking, the second year students, who were very sophisticated, came rushing down the corridor and yelling, "Abbasso fascismo, Abbasso fascismo." And they rushed up to the platform and started wrestling with the president for the microphone. And he screamed at me, "You gutter snuts, get out of here." And they called down the personnel that was supposed to try to maintain order. Well, that was my first experience there.
Welcome to City College.
So we got to the point where I became a more sophisticated person. And I joined the campus, but not through stories, but to dole out the 5 cents for the expense money going down to the printer and checking to see that we had enough money to print each of the issues. In that capacity, I had many experiences, of course, close experiences with the editor-in-chief. And in my year as senior, the editor-in-chief was a man named Rosenberg, who was a very talented guy, but he was an outright communist. His predecessor was an outright communist. And Rosenberg went on after graduation to become a journalist. He was a reporter during World War II. He was stationed in Paris and was issuing his reports during the war. But he was now no longer Rosenberg. He was now Rosemont. Similarly, the man who was the editor-in-chief in 1937, who was a very virulent communist, he turned out afterwards to become the general manager of a commercial organization to try to improve the situation, to improve industrial activities for the owners of various businesses. So there was a transition, a very real transition for all of these people. City College also, I remember very keenly, in 1936, was the time of people signing up to fight in Spain. I was in a history course given by a Professor Megaro, who was a refugee from Italy. He came up in to give this course. It was given in a big lecture hall. And his first words were packed lecture hall. He said, I want to make things easy. I want all of the people who are Leninists seated on the left. Stalinists next to them. The Leonists next to them. Socialists and all other people, so that everybody can identify what's going on and who's saying what. All of that material somehow or other disappeared with World War II, when Russia invaded Poland, and there was a lot of disillusionment on the part of the communists. And you then had a change, tremendous change in the outlook of various students. And City College represents the ultimate of the mechanism for transition. Certainly, that was the case for me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Urban.
If you missed that, that was Herbert Rubin, class of 1938, in case you missed that. Okay, we are going to...
So I would like to
Rubin
add...
is a witness of City College in the 1930s, and if you want to see a film, tells you more about it. I hope you'll all stay for Arguing the World later on today.
And one
Okay,
other
so
comment,
I would like to add something
one
here.
more comment about the 1930s.
It's just like being back in class. Okay, I'm going to fight for my opportunity to speak up as if I were back at City College. So I wanted to add a couple of things that have to do with the fact that we were commuters. We were on the subway. As Vivian Gornick said, it was very different at Berkeley. Friends who went with me to City and then went on to Berkeley and were part of the free speech movement, their response was, well, at City, we had to go home at night. At Berkeley, we'd stay out because our parents weren't watching after us, and therefore we could be active in the free speech movement. But the second thing I wanted to add there was I also, like Mr. Berger, came from music and art as an art major to City College. And I was torn. I was an art major, but I was challenged by my boyfriend to take the biology course for the scientists, not for the liberal arts. So there I go into the bio course. It's the first time they've seen an art major on North Campus in Shepherd Hall. And they find this really fascinating. I actually can learn the terms. I'm good at dissecting. I learned how to say dissect rather than dissect. All the important things. And our professors in biology were all people who were extraordinary faculty. They were trained at Harvard for the most part, that privileged place up in the Boston area. And they were there to really teach us. And so they took an interest in me. And they were extra specimens that I could take home to dissect. So I took one home midday, put it on the fire escape because it smelled from formaldehyde. Went back, took the rest of my courses, came home, and I couldn't find the fish. It had been out on the fire escape. My mother said, well, I put it in the refrigerator. So that was a combination of being in City. I returned to City then later on, after gone that track down to Columbia and back as a faculty member into the bio department, and now there was open admissions. And especially in the context of talking about Jews in City College, my chair at the time said to me, Sandy, you know what we've learned? There are some stupid Jews. They couldn't get in before, and now they can get in because of open admissions. Said, but there are so many other smart kids, and that it was a wonderful thing. So I want to add, we all need to fight to get back free tuition. In the interim, though, I started following through with something the Alumni Association suggested to me 10 years ago, which is that I pay tuition for one student straight through for their 4 years. It gives them the freedom to just have 2 outside jobs in order to do it, rather than having 3 or 4. And I think that's probably something everybody here, pardon? But I think that's something that almost everyone here could afford. But it's only for a very narrow slice of people. Yes, but it isn't really most of our students. Very few of them. So I would really encourage you to look at the ways that until we can get back free tuition, that you can make a difference. And thank you.
We're going to have time for about, I would say, 3 more comments or questions. 3 more.
Over here as well.
Okay. So one of the things I'm noticing listening to all of you is that even a few years difference and when you went to the school makes a difference, that your experience is actually maybe even unrecognizable to one another. So I want to come back to the time when I was there. And you were just discussing a moment ago about rights and whether there was an activist program. And I remember very clearly, I was a student of Leo Hamalian as a freshman. He was a wonderful English professor, died just a few years ago. And he organized bus trips to join the sit-ins. We went by bus. And I remember it very, very clearly, especially because I couldn't go. I wasn't allowed to go. I was, I'm still at home and I'm just a freshman. And my mother absolutely refused to let me take chances like that to go south with Leo. So we did have activists of that sort. I also want to mention that as far as the Jewish identity issue. I see we have a few music and art graduates. I was a music and art graduate as well. And during my growing up, even though my parents were Holocaust survivors, I had a very, very Jewish environment, but not at all religious. I knew nothing about my Judaism. At City College, I discovered my Judaism because I was at the Hillel. I found Hillel, and I'm sorry, Irena is not here, Irena Klepfish, because we knew each other then. And that played a very important role for me. That was probably the most important influences on my life. But I think in general, I would agree that the Jewish identity was very, very secondary. So for me, it meant a lot, but I'm very happy to see the diversity that we now have.
You know, it's probably worth noting that communism and Stalinism was adverse to Judaism. You know, the left-wing part of, the communist part of the heritage of City College would be at war with the, Judaic part of it. So that makes kind of sense that wouldn't be stressed by the communist contingent.
Except 38 and 39, going into the war, not among the hardest core of people on the left, but those had a certain ambivalence towards their identity as universalists as opposed to being Jewish, began to change somewhat. And again, there was a conflict in their own consciousness raised by the war. I want to say one more thing about the 1930s. We, if you don't mind, at City College, the Jeremiah T. Mahoney Gymnasium. Jeremiah T. Mahoney, who was an Olympic athlete, was one of the major forces who fought against Avery Brundage during the conflict over the 1936 Olympics. City College men in the forefront of fighting for the boycott, which sadly didn't succeed. And of course, you have the 36 Olympics, the Berlin Olympics, and you know the stories of Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller. But it's nice and appropriate that the gymnasium is named for Jeremiah T. Mahoney, who, by the way, wasn't exactly Jewish.
I have a comment. I just want to reinforce Mr. Davidoff was saying about launching his own career. I'm an immigrant myself. I came here at age 12, and I barely knew English. And thanks to the New York City Public School, I got to learn English. And I had a teacher, I remember her, Miss Brennan, with blue hair. And they put me in what we used to call the sweat hogs, if everybody's familiar with Welcome Better. I was in that class for a while. And then I did end up at City College. And when I was in junior high, I learned my English. Besides school, I watched a lot of television. I watched Three Stooges because I could really understand what was going on. But I was taken in by the commercials. They were very inventive commercials. And somehow I got into my head, I want to go into advertising. But I ended up at City College, is a long how I got in there. But they sent me, the guidance people saying, well, if you want to study advertising, you got to go to Baruch. And I did go to Baruch. And I had this notion, much like the Mad Men idea, creative people, you could jingles and all that kind of stuff. I didn't understand that you had to understand business programs, what the marketing was and all that. I just wanted to write jingles. So I'm at Baruch, and like everybody's already working. They got job, and they come in with these briefcases, a bunch of accountants. I said, you don't understand. I want to be creative. So I end up back uptown, and I take a course. I look at the catalog, and I end up in a journalism course. I say, maybe I could do that. And that's where Irving Rosenthal took me under his wing. And he found the spark in my stomach and lit it. And that's how I got into my career, thanks to Irving Rosenthal. And because of him, I got involved with the Alumni Association. And I'm forever grateful to City College for launching me on my career.
I'm probably one of the few people who is not an alumni of college, and I teach in NYU. I want to connect the whole discussion here, which is fascinating. It's really fascinating. This is a very kind of a high-power team here on the stage. And I want to ask you, when you're looking at the colleges today with the increased anti-Semitism, when you're looking at the radical of the colleges today, which is basically towards Israel, what can you say about the radicalism that started from City College? And what can you do today? Because I think that this is audience which is probably very sensitive to this issue of increased anti-Semitism in the city, in the colleges, and what we've seen today. And you have tremendous experience, and I would love to hear from you, your perspective from your decades of experience of what do you see today and how do you connect it? Thank you.
He says anti-Semitism is rising.
Well,
And what do we say?
what our experience we might do about anti-Semitism today? Well, first of all, as a journalist, keep the issue alive. Keep writing about it. Keep protesting instances of outbreaks. Get the word out. Silence obviously doesn't work. And I think the more programs that are arranged and City College can lead by example. But I mean, it's a problem. It's not going to have an easy solution because you don't even need Jews for anti-Semitism, they found. I mean, anti-Semitism has cropped up in countries in Europe after they were basically eliminated. So, but it keeps rearing its head, and it needs to be exposed wherever it can be.
You know, during the glory years of City College, the 30s and 40s, there was virulent anti-Semitism in America, and especially in New York City. And the school, I mean, anti-Semitism rises and falls over and over again. For me, the time to worry is when the government changes the laws in relation to Jews. I don't see it as the great threat that many people do. I mean, for me, it's a marginal movement.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. We're going to take one more question now about City College and up there, and then we are going to move to the next piece of our program. Thank you.
My question is, I understand at some point there was a class of some sort of how to get rid of your New York accent.
Yes.
Did you have experience with that?
Yes,
and what are your memories? What do you think of that?
We took speech classes. I was about to say that. We took speech classes which were meant to purge us of our dentalized T's and D's. Yes.
I never knew we had a New York accent.
Yeah, right.
No, I thought that everybody else had the accent, and mine was the right thing. So.
Which really leads us to a complication that none of us have mentioned, and that is there was a great discrepancy between the students, the faculty, the whole ethos of City College, and the administrations, over and over and over again. They really, truly, to some degree, were repelled by the New York working class Jewish atmosphere. I mean, when you mentioned Robinson wielding his umbrella against Italian anti-fascists and calling them gutter snipes, that has been recorded over and over and over again, that many did think we were gutter snipes right up until yesterday and wanted to purge us of. There's a famous story by Thomas Wolfe on teaching at NYU in the 30s. And he, of course, is the writer who could let it go, let's just let it rip. And he is repelled by his Jewish students, these Aravis. So it wasn't that simple. And I think Buell Gallagher felt the same way about us. I mean, he really They wanted us to be ladies and gentlemen. They did not want us to be who we were.
You know, by the way, the end of that story with Robinson and the umbrella, when he waved his umbrella and called them gutter snipes, the protest at City College that followed, the students made a huge umbrella.
Oh, really?
And paraded it around the campus with the slogan, "I am a gutter snipe. I fight fascism."
Oh, great. Oh, really? Oh, that's a good story.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And let me turn the program over to Judy right now.
Thank you. So I want to thank the panel. That was really interesting. And we are now going to bring up our final two and very eagerly awaited speakers for the morning, and then we break for food. I'm very happy to say that President Vincent Boudreau is here, the 13th and current president of CCNY. He will conclude our program this morning. But before he does, we have another very special guest who has an incredible life story and a really interesting CCNY story. Lev Sviridov is a refugee from the former Soviet Union. He came here as a child, graduated in 2005, which is 2005, not 1905. He became a Rhodes Scholar, earned his PhD in chemistry at Oxford, and is now the head of the Macaulay Honors Program at Hunter. They're very lucky to have him, and so are we. So with no further ado, Lev Sviridov.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you to the Center for Jewish History for hosting this wonderful event. I mean, frankly, every day of being a resident of New York City is a celebration of City College, because frankly, when we first arrived here, I was 10 years old. I think somebody said they were 12 when they got here. I felt that in New York, everyone is somewhat Jewish. And it was something that's only been reinforced time and time again. I'd also like to start by recognizing Matt Goldstein, who I think is somewhere in here. He was here earlier, because the university that I got to experience from 2000 to 2005 is really a vision of Matt Goldstein's to bring it back to the golden age of its past. So thank you, Matt. Now, frankly, as I mentioned, no institution has done more to define the culture of a city. And I arrived in 2000. And my mom and I had just immigrated in 1993. I didn't know how to speak English. I didn't know what anything was. I didn't know what baseball was. I didn't really understand the culture nor the place. But I was lucky. We were here. I attended PS 11 down on 20th and 8th and the Clinton School, and got the privilege of attending the Ethical Culture Fieldston School on a scholarship for my high school years. And I was completely a fish out of water. I didn't understand the people. They didn't understand me. And so when it came to college, yes, my grades were great. I could have gone to Columbia, MIT, Fordham offered me some money, but then there was City College. And I was trying to sit down with my Jewish mother, and a lot of people have already discussed their family dynamics. And my mom says, I don't know what a loan is, but I don't like it. And I looked at her. I was 18 and somewhat ambitious to follow what my classmates were doing, to say I too wanted to go to Columbia. I said, Mom, I don't know what it is either, but I want one. Well, it didn't quite pan out that way. And I got to the university at a really incredible point. It was really transitioning. It was a university in transition. It was a college in transition. I was in transition. Everything around me seemed to be in transition, because it was the end of remedial education and beginning of honors education. We had a new president, we had a new chancellor, and there was a new era of real, meaningful alumni engagement. And it is interesting to be at any City College gathering, because everyone looks back on their Bronx years. And when my mom and I finally settled here, we settled at 1220 Grand Concourse. Now, unlike most of you, I was the token white boy for miles. And now that I'm a fancy bureaucrat, I live at 158th and Walton Avenue. So, right by the courthouse. So if you ever want to come back at a field trip, you're always welcome. I live in the Finnish building. Some of you may remember it. Varma Co-ops. It's still a Finnish building, oddly enough. So, but how does it all connect? There's a great narrative here between what we've just heard about City College's activism and education, and it carried over into the 21st century, We argued, we fought, we protested, we've done a lot of things. But there were incredibly important points, just like Jeff mentioned Kristallnacht. For my class, it was 9/11. I remember as vividly as yesterday when I came out of 145th Street train station, having taken the D train all of 2 stops, and all of the trains were ending at 145th Street. It was 8:30 in the morning. And they said, something has happened downtown. The trains are not going down. And I remember running up, because I was late to my organic chemistry lecture. And I decided, you know what? Let me go up to Amsterdam Avenue. And if you remember, if you look straight down Amsterdam Avenue, you could see the World Trade Towers. And I remember standing up there and seeing the Trade Towers on fire. It was incredible. It was hard because at the time my mom was attending the Israeli Film Festival that was having its opening reception down there. I didn't know what was happening. Most of us did. I went to organic chem lecture in a room roughly this size. I sat through all the ketones and the alkynes and all this. And then a silence came over the class, and the professor said, you know, perhaps this is going to be the least important lecture you attend today. You need to go outside. And we all went out. Excuse me. And we stood on Amsterdam Avenue. We looked at those buildings. We didn't know what it was going to do, what it was going to change. But we stood there, just as one of them came straight down. And it really didn't matter whether you were Jewish, black, Hispanic, immigrant, local, whatever. I think at that moment we were all New Yorkers, we were all City College students, and that made all of us, the whole world, Jewish, even more. Because there was something bigger, there were bigger forces, and yet many of us wanted to go back to those classrooms to focus on our studies, to advance our careers. But in that moment, we had our sad, terrifying, but unifying moment. Now, you know, it wasn't the only moment like that. I will say that a year later, I ran and I became student body president, which was an interesting experience in its own right, because having come out of Fieldston, where I was pretty much silent the entire time, to have arrived at City College, taken in a nice deep breath, and realizing that I was in my club in the right place where immigrants and everyone was welcome, I found my voice. As you can see, I still use it. And not just because I'm a faculty member. But it was an amazing time because we got to pull together. And I had those phone calls to the president and from the president, at time Gregory H. Williams. And I remember the blackout of 2002. I was sitting in my office in student government. I was feeling all important in the basement of the North Academic Building. And the lights went out and the alarm sounded again. And I thought, oh my God, you know, this is 9/11 all over again. And I tried calling on my cell phone to the president's office. They didn't pick up because, of course, cell phone towers went out, but the landline still worked. So I called his office and I said, did we forget to pay the bill? And he said, it's not us this time. It's happening everywhere. And it just shows that City College, just like in your years and in my years, was very much a flat organization. It was there for the students, largely run by the students, with input from administration. And that tradition continues to this day. I will say that it was that voice that empowered me to stay engaged in the city. And there was somebody asked, does it give you a responsibility for the city? Absolutely it does. Much more important than that, it gives you the tools to be liberated from student debt to go and dedicate yourself to civil service. It's critical that we remain committed to civil service because, frankly, nothing bothers me more, nothing concerns me more than the integrity of our public institutions. And this isn't something recent. Some people tie this to the Trump effect. No. This is something that concerns me very deeply. We have to have faith and confidence in our public institutions, whether it's on issues of law and order, whether it's on issues of criminal justice, education, whether it's fighting anti-Semitism. There's a place for every single one of those things in our public institutions and our public discourse. And frankly, City College sets the bar and the norm for what should be acceptable, and that literally means everything. It means everything. And that's what our public institutions need to represent. Now, most of my friends after Oxford went off to wonderful careers, whether it was in consulting, law, or business. But I decided to come back to City College. And I joined a small team of researchers at the Grove School of Engineering who founded the Energy Institute, the Cuny Energy Institute. I spent wonderful 3 years there with some great scientists and great engineers. We spun out a little company that's doing manufacturing right here in New York State. But it was another small way that City College is now paving the way for the future. And I think every single one of you should be very, very proud of what the school has done and continues to do, because the bridges I built there have now lasted 20 years. And I know for many of you that's not so much, but for me it's a lot. Because I came in still learning how to speak English. I came in not really knowing what I wanted to be. But right after I'm done here, I'm meeting my best friend who we met in General Chem 1. He's a Puerto Rican guy who studied engineering, and we did everything together, and we still do. And he's driving me up to see a house with my mother in another part of the Bronx to see where we may want to get a place for her. But these bridges are cross-cultural, they're cross-national, they cross-identity. These are the narratives that City College has fostered for the city. And it's a rich culture that continues, frankly, into the 21st century now. So I'll be forever grateful for everything that you have done to create the legacy that I got to inherit. It is a legacy that I'd like to pass on to all of my students now in my capacity as director of Macaulay at the sister school of City College at Hunter College. And there are some sturdy sisters. And it's a place that really needs your engagement now more than ever. Because this concern that I have for the integrity of our public institutions, I really got to share with one of my Oxford contemporaries, and namely with his dad. You may have heard of him, he goes by Pete. And he was a classmate of mine. And I mainly argued with his dad on the question of integrity of public institutions, because that's what Joe spent most of his time thinking about. And now Pete's running for president. And it's kind of nice to sort of, on one hand, thank you. And it's nice on one hand to be a beneficiary of a great public university. And now, fast forward 15 years later since I first met Pete, to be talking about what it takes to build one for the 21st century while advancing both American ideals and making sure that we find a place for everyone in this country, no matter who they are or where they come from. That's the role of City College. That's the role that all of you have played. That's the role that will continue to play, and it needs your support now more than ever to pick up the phone and call the governor, call the president, and advocate on behalf of this institution, because we need our alumni to come back to the school, stay with the school, and help our great new president, Vince Boudreau, to take it into the 21st century and beyond. With that, I turn it over to Vince.
Thank you, Liv. Jack, I was listening to you talk about your athletic past, and in my new role, I spend a fair amount of time with members of the Athletic Alumni Association, and there's something that you hear when you hang out with this group of guys, and it's not quite a motto. Maybe it should be. What they say is, the older we get, the better we were, and I love that. I am entering in September my 29th year on the campus of City College. I came really knowing nothing about, I stepped foot, grew up in Syracuse, stepped foot in New York City for the very first time to interview for a job at CCNY. So I had no idea what I was getting into. And within about 2 or 3 years, I just fell in love with the institution. And I got to tell you, in the early 1990s, it wasn't always easy to love City College. You know, it was a place where those great buildings were shrouded in black netting, where we were still suffering the long, decades-long hangover from the crisis of New York City. But it gives me a perspective. It gives me a kind of almost 30-year perspective on what the institution has done and where it's gone and where I think it needs to go. And one of the things I think is relevant to this conversation is that there are moments, Lev kind of alluded to one of them, but there are moments in our history that transform who we are. And many of those moments are exogenous moments. It was about, you know, I came as a specialist in the political science department in Asian studies. So in 1992, when I taught my very first Asian studies class, my class was full. My class was full of recent immigrants from China, refugees, people that had been at or been near or been affected by Tiananmen Square. And it was the very beginning of a wave of Chinese immigration that in many places in the country defines what a university looks like. And what I noticed about these students is they were all they wanted to talk about was democracy. Any topic I introduced, eventually a Chinese student would stand up and talk about democracy. What was it? How could we build it? What did it look like? And what was striking to me in those early years is the only language they had to talk about democracy was Maoist language. And 2 years later, 3 years later, that would have all disappeared. But they came first to City College with what they had to try to figure out who they were going to be. 2 years later, we were started to see people who were coming from East Germany and Czechoslovakia after the Berlin Wall had come down. And then a few years later, after the wars that broke up Yugoslavia in big numbers, we started to see students from that part of the country. And I've watched that pattern over the last 30 years, where anytime there is a crisis in the world, 2 years later at City College, we see those students. When I was still teaching political science, and this goes back maybe about 5 or 6 years, I was teaching big section classes of 200 students in a big auditorium, and it was striking over about a 5-year period the number of hijabs that you would see as students from Afghanistan and Iraq and other places in the Middle East would come in to the college. And I think about that because when you talk about the relationship between Jewish people in New York and City College, you often get the sense that nothing at CCNY came before the great Jewish period when 90% of the students were Jewish. But of course, that's not true. By the turn of the 19th century, we were, 1903, 75% of our students were Jewish. 1903. In 1910, 90% of our students were Jewish, and that would continue all the way up into World War II. But what was interesting about those first early years was a couple of things. First of all, CCNY as an institution, Morris Friedman describes it as almost not a college. It was a kind of combination of students who were pre-freshmen, trying to get their degrees, trying to figure things out. 1,000 students came in to the City College class that would graduate in 1906. 140 graduated 4 years later. And so you have a couple of things going on at the moment when Jewish students first came into the college. Number one, you have an institution, and you heard it on this earlier panel, you have an institution that is set up not to be hospitable to Jewish people. Bernard Baruch, when he graduated in the last years of the 19th century, was incensed by the fact that Jewish students weren't allowed in our fraternities. And in fact, on our campus, the very first fraternity in the country that didn't care what your religion was founded at City College a few years later. We had, as you heard, an administration that had a certain level of contempt for Jewish students. Trouble going late in this program is all your good stories have been used up. But so let me touch on some of them. A lot of our school teachers were blocked by the fact that their accents had to be purged of a New York accent, which of course means a Jewish accent. That's how it was looked at. Mandatory chapel, mandatory religious services, Protestant services on campus only ended in the early 1900s. And as you heard Mr. Rubin say earlier, we continued to call the assemblies that would happen in the Great Hall chapel, even though they weren't necessarily religious. And so you have this at the administration level, this resistance to a new City College. And you always through the years in these moments of transition have this relationship between the old City College and the new City College and how that transition doesn't happen over a period of 1 or 2 years. And I think really that when you see it in time, the transition plays out in two ways. There's first this question of what's the culture of the college going to be and how are we going to be accepted? Are we going to be accepted by the college? And the second is in this question of success rates. You know, time and again you hear people saying these new students coming in don't fit the mold of City College. And you heard it in 1906 when 10% of our students graduated. It was in the mind of many that there was a new kind of student on campus. And they weren't as good as the old students, the old Protestant students that came to City College when it had a military ethic. The second thing that you find is that the college often takes time to figure out what it means to make students successful. And so there's a legacy, really, of those two kinds of struggles on campus, the struggle of a new culture against an old culture, the struggle of students with new academic needs, working in an institution that needs to accommodate those needs. One of them is that a student's sense of their own will to succeed comes to define what it means to be successful at City College. And I can't tell you how many alumni have told me the story, maybe apocryphal, but probably not, of being in Shepherd Hall and having somebody say, you can say it with me, look to your left, look to your right, right? And there's not a person that's told me that story that didn't tell it to me in a kind of celebratory vein. Because anyone telling me that story was the person that stayed behind, right? And so you get this sense that to succeed at City College means that you overcame great odds. I mean, think back to the film we saw when we first convened. Those are guys that and women who love CCNY, right? But to a person, they talk about, you know, how difficult it was to get classes, how hard it was to succeed in this institution. Morris Friedman, when he talks about, he has a great article that comes out in 1980 where he talks about his days at City College, and he says, I wasn't happy. And he goes through and he talks about all the things that made him unhappy when he was at City College. And they include a lot of elements of economic hardship, but mostly where his unhappiness centers is a sense that in the upper administration, the college was not for him, right? He talks about being in the student cafeteria down in the basement of Shepherd Hall, and they'd be in the middle of eating food, and the custodial staff would come by and clear their food off the table while they were in the middle of eating it. And down the hall, the lavatories didn't have doors on them. And so you remember that? And so when he went to NYU, professors would say to him, how come when I go to City College and I walk the halls, it always smells like urine? And he had this feeling that the reason, and Vivian, this gets back to kind of what you were saying, the reason that why City College was good was because the students struggled to make it good. That what you got to your left and your right in a classroom rather than in front of the classroom was what defined you and defined your success. I want to weigh in a little bit on the little fight about whether it was the faculty or the students. My experience is this. When students talk to each other, I mean, imagine, if you're going to graduate from City College, you will have taken about 40 professors by the time you graduate. When students talk to each other, they talk about their lousy professors. And they talk about how great it is to be with one another. When alumni, mainly, reflect back on their City College experience, they can sift through the 40 professors and say, these are the 2 or 3 that made a difference in my life. And I think both things are true. I think they're both true today, and they probably were both true back in the day. But it is true when you read, you know, the memoirs of people that have graduated in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, that what they say is, we succeeded because we had to struggle, and we got the most from the people that were in the classroom with us rather than with the professors. And so as Morris Friedman says it, he talks about that as producing a particular culture at City College. His exact words are, there was a special, defiant, independent, contentious, attention-seeking qualities that came to define the student body. And one of the things I want to say to you is that became something that became detached from whatever Jewish origins it may have had. Friedman goes on to say that in addition to that, Jewish students recognized that the institution valued the two virtues of scholarship and argumentation that also helped define Jewish culture. But I think at City College, it becomes separated from Jewish culture. And so today, when we bring faculty members in from around the country and they lecture to our classes, to a person, they say, we're never put to the test in our home institutions the way we are at City College. Ron and I were talking before class, and Ron's point is the students of today are nowhere near as argumentative as you all were. But if you look at, but students today in general are not as argumentative as they used to be. And I will tell you, when faculty come to CCNY, it's one of the things they fasten on. And so you have this sense throughout what we could call the Jewish period at CCNY, that this was an institution that if you did well here, it really meant something. I'm thinking of Joe Flum, probably the shortest graduation speech in the history of any institution. Remember it? He stepped to the microphone when he was given his honorary degree, leaned into the mic, and said the following: "After City College, everything was easy." And then he sat down. But there is this sense built into the reality and the mythology of City College as the place where you went and you only graduated. You only became that person of the one to your left and the one to your right who graduated if you were really, really good. Irving Howe says that the Jewish students loved the place. They loved it utterly, hopelessly, blindly. And I want to tell you what I find in the students today, because we have, Lev alluded to it, we have gone through another one of those transitions over the last 30 years. We went in the period of 5 years when our white population was 90% of the student body to a period when our white population was today about 18% of the student body. And those numbers have been consistent since the 1970s. But what I see in today's student body is literally a love-hate relationship with the institution. And here's what I mean by that. Like the students that Friedman describes, the students who see the City College as an embodiment of their own values, that recognize specifically the talents of the ones who survive, our students come to the campus and almost to a person say, I never knew that going to college felt like I would be reflected in the student body. You know, you look out on an assembly of CCNY students today, and they look like the world. And they know it. They are so proud of their institution because they feel that City College was a place that was made for them, specifically for them. You know, when I speak to students, when I speak at freshman convocation every year in the Great Hall, one of the first things I do is I call their attention to the architecture. And I make sure they understand that the building in all its grandeur, in all of its architectural expectations for success and glory, was built not for somebody else, not for some other demographic or for some other purpose, but specifically for the success of the students that come to our campus every day. And they love the campus, love it. On the other hand, when they climb up escalators that don't work, or computers go out in the middle of tests, or there isn't enough equipment, there it is again. There isn't enough equipment in an engineering lab for them to do an experiment. They hate the campus. And they hate it because they understand in that lack that somebody thinks that that's good enough for our demographic, for our students. And so they carry both of those things around. They carry both of those things around with them at the same time. This is my place. I love it. It's going to make my future. And somebody thinks it's okay that our roofs leak or we don't have enough faculty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not so different, by the way, from what people write about City College in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. We look back at those days as if it was all Raymond the Bagel Man and Bertrand Russell trying to get in. By the way, that's the cheapest laugh line I get in any assembly of City College. You mention that guy's name and you've got the room. We forget that when you turn on, and if Matthew Goodman is still here, this is all lifted from his book. You have a tremendous opportunity to listen to somebody who knows the college inside and out when Matthew's book, The City Game, comes here in the second installation of this. We forget that when you turned on the light switch, it took 5 minutes or 5 seconds across campus before the electricity came in because our electrical system was below standard. We forget that our lavatories didn't have doors and our other facilities were broken down. Right? So it's been a kind of consistent element of City College that you're marked as a City College graduate because you were tough enough and persistent enough and you believed in yourself and your student colleagues. I'm gonna undo this from here. Your student colleagues believed enough in you that despite the state of the institution, you embodied excellence. That the institution, for all of its threadbare appearance, recognized what was founded on the idea that to overlook potential, as many of our institutions routinely do, is a tragedy. And we will only be great as a nation if we commit ourselves to recognizing the potential of people who are often under-resourced and marginalized and don't show as successful out of the gate. I want to just briefly go back and reflect on those attrition rates because something else vitally important has happened in our educational culture over the last 30 years. And I don't want to leave this stage without pointing it out. If you think about those attrition rates, if you think about a little more than 10% of students graduating in 1906, or the idea that only 30% of City College students would graduate later in our history. The thing that you never hear in connection with those figures is a sense of shame. That was a mark of the rigor and the excellence of the institution and the quality of the graduates who somehow made it through the gauntlet. And that's not where we are today. Where we are today, and part of it has to do with a broader sense of democracy, a broader sense of what the distribution of human potential in our society, that we are called every day to make a commitment to as many of our students graduating as possible. And that's a good thing. But the second part of it is a tricky thing. Because if you're going to make the investment in the potential of people who are often overlooked, you're going to have to grapple with the pressure to succeed in a difficult challenge. And about 30 years ago, as the idea of public education as an unambiguous social good that we would all benefit from, no matter if we have kids in school, no matter if we went to these institutions or not, that we benefit as a society from an educated population, that idea began to give way to the question of why should I pay my tax dollars to benefit this individual, right? And once we started down that road, our entire educational system, how it was funded, how we tracked students, how we used computer data, moved to a way of saying we are going to pay for, support, be invested in students to succeed to the extent they succeed. We will pay for classes that they need to take to graduate and not a penny more. We will pay for students so long as they hit certain marks of achievement. And so as an institution, we can no longer say we're going to take in a big population of students and we're going to identify talent in that population. We now need to make sure that as many of our students graduate, succeed, as possible. And we are committed to that. But I will tell you that to get there, the data is unambiguous. The great success stories in student success around this country require labor be applied to the students. Right? Our current student to advisor ratio at the college in some departments is 550 students to one advisor. The national standard is 150 to 1. Right? That's the kind, and that disinvestment in the basic infrastructure of our college has been on a 25-year trajectory. We talk about the need to provision our students to make tuition free. If we had a financial aid apparatus that provided adequate counseling to our students, 75% of our students, the ones eligible for full financial aid, would never pay tuition. But they fall through the cracks of the bureaucracy because it's complicated. You saw the New York Times article, are you good enough at paperwork to be poor in America? That applies to every one of our students. Right? So a couple of things have changed, but one big one that has changed is the idea that we need as a society to be vigilant that our institutions are giving unfair individual advantage to students, and we have to claw that back. There is no idea that is more corrosive to the quality of public education in our country than that idea that we need to be vigilant against individuals gaming the system. And it's an entirely different approach to public education than the approach that people took when you were students at City College. I want to talk just one last thing about where we are in terms of our Jewish history and our contemporary population. You know, as president, one of the things that defines my work is collecting stories from alumni. And people talk to me about what it was like to be a student, what they did, who they met, what they remembered. And I had one alum that talked to me about, very proudly, about being a member of Hillel. And he talked to me about, as part of his membership in Hillel, working in a Jewish store in the Bronx and learning and understanding Yiddish and being a guy that would kind of listen to Jewish shoppers speaking Yiddish so he could figure out who was a serious buyer and who wasn't a serious buyer. It was Colin Powell. He learned Yiddish as a member of Hillel at City College and never particularly thought about the peculiarity of that. Some of Jamaican immigrants, African American from the Bronx, on our campus, learning Yiddish and using it, you know, for the benefit of his shop owners, because nobody expected a black kid from the Bronx to speak Yiddish or understand it. We have today somebody referenced our Jewish Studies program. Do you know what defines our Jewish Studies program? It has more non-Jewish students studying Judaism and Judaic traditions than any other program in the country. And so that's where we are right now. When a student comes to this institution that they feel was built by them, this institution that today's students love every bit as much as the Jewish students that Irving Howe described, loved the City College of the 50s and 60s. Right? They come to a place where the diversity of our population means that a Dominican student or an African American student is every bit as interested in learning about Jewish history or traveling to Israel as they are in going to Senegal or going to the Dominican Republic. You know, we had a question earlier about the rise of anti-Semitism on campuses and in our society in general. If there is a solution to that, then I show you our Jewish Studies program. I show you our student body. I say to you that as our country becomes more fragmented and more sorted out into demographic and racial and ethnic and linguistic categories, it is in places like City College where we have the wherewithal to put people who are vastly different together and bring them to some sort of common understanding of one another. So I love this institution. I love what it is. I love what it's done. But we are also we are also a place that is unique in America. We're unique in our diversity. We're unique in our capacity to produce social mobility. And we're unique in our ability from that diversity to deliver an experience to students that's not segregated in any way. Diversity doesn't matter to us because we're giving Black kids or brown kids a chance that they wouldn't get anyplace else. Diversity matters today as it did in the past, because if you sit in a City College classroom, you will be surrounded by people from around the world in an experience that is virtually unique in the country and in the world. So, thank you very much.